The forest was never this quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath as orange torchlight flickered between the trees, painting restless shadows across the ground. Somewhere beyond the dense line of trunks, a low rhythmic chant rose and fell like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate, vibrating through the earth itself. She shouldn't have come. Pressed flat against the rough bark of an old pine, she forced herself to stay still, barely daring to breathe. The air smelled of smoke, damp soil, and something metallic she couldn't quite place. Her fingers dug into the moss clinging to the tree as she leaned just far enough to see past the trunk. They were gathered in a clearing she had never seen before. Dozens of figures formed a wide circle, their silhouettes broken by the shifting flames of tall iron torches planted into the ground. Cloaks draped over their shoulders, heads bowed, their voices blending into a single hypnotic murmur. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the kind that settled into her chest and made her pulse race faster with every beat. At the center of the circle stood one man. He didn't need a torch to be seen. The others seemed to orbit him, leaving a wide space as if even the air belonged to him alone. Broad-shouldered, unmoving, he faced the dark forest rather than the pack around him, his long coat stirred only slightly by the cold night breeze. The Alpha King. Even from a distance, his presence pressed against her like a physical force. She had seen him before, from afar, during gatherings where she kept her head lowered like everyone else, but never like this. Never without the layers of ceremony and distance that made him seem untouchable. Now he looked different. Tense. His hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles pale in the torchlight, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something no one else could hear. The chanting continued, slow and ritualistic, yet a ripple of unease moved through the circle. Some of them shifted their weight, their voices wavering for just a fraction of a second before steadying again. She swallowed, her throat dry. This was the forbidden ceremony, the one whispered about in half-finished sentences and quickly silenced conversations. No one spoke of what truly happened here. They only said that anyone caught watching it would regret it for the rest of their life, however short that might be. And still she had come. Curiosity had dragged her here at first, that and the strange disappearances of certain pack members on nights just like this. But now, crouched behind the tree with her heart pounding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it, curiosity felt like the worst mistake she had ever made. The chanting grew louder. The Alpha slowly lifted his hands and the circle tightened, every pair of eyes fixed on him. The flames bent and flickered, casting sharp lines across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw, the faint tremor running through his fingers. Something was wrong. He inhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling in a way that looked almost strained. A murmur of concern rippled through the pack, quickly swallowed by the continued chant, but she saw it. The way his shoulders stiffened, the way his head dipped as if fighting against an invisible weight pressing down on him. Her breath caught. Was he in pain? She leaned forward without meaning to, just a little more, trying to see his face clearly through the shifting torchlight. The bark scraped softly against her sleeve as she adjusted her grip on the tree. And then, without warning, the chanting stopped. The silence crashed down so suddenly it rang in her ears. The Alpha froze at the center of the clearing. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hands. For a moment, no one moved. Even the flames seemed to hesitate, their light flickering over dozens of tense, waiting faces. Then he lifted his head. Not toward the circle. Toward the trees. Toward her. His eyes narrowed, scanning the darkness with unsettling precision, as if he could see straight through the layers of shadow and leaves. The air in her lungs vanished. She hadn't made a sound. She was sure of it. She hadn't stepped on a twig, hadn't shifted the branches, hadn't even exhaled too loudly. And yet, he was looking directly at the spot where she hid. A cold shiver ran down her spine as his gaze locked onto the trunk shielding her. The faintest crease appeared between his brows, not anger, something closer to confusion, or recognition. How? She mouthed silently, her fingers trembling against the bark. Behind him, the rest of the pack began to stir, following his line of sight toward the darkness at the edge of the clearing. He took one slow step forward. And in that moment, with dozens of eyes beginning to search the shadows and the most powerful man she had ever known staring straight through her hiding place, only one thought echoed in her mind. If he could sense her without even seeing her, what would he do when he finally found her? The Alpha King's gaze remained fixed on the tree where she hid, but he did not move any closer. For a long, breathless moment, the forest seemed suspended between two worlds, the flickering, ritual-lit clearing and the shadowed safety where she clung to the bark, every muscle locked in place. Then, with a sharp motion of his hand, he signaled the others to remain where they were. The chanting did not resume. The silence stretched, heavy and expectant, before he slowly lowered his head again. After a few seconds that felt like an eternity, he turned back toward the center of the circle. The torches crackled softly and one by one the pack members relaxed, though none of them dared to speak. She didn't move until the ceremony resumed. Only when the rhythmic chant began again, cautious at first, did she allow herself to draw a silent breath. Her lungs burned as if she had been underwater for minutes. She pressed her forehead briefly against the rough bark, her pulse hammering in her ears. He had sensed her. Not seen her. Not heard her. Sensed her. A cold understanding began to settle in her chest, replacing the sharp spike of fear with something deeper and more dangerous. The realization that everything she thought she knew about her own pack was incomplete. Her name was Elara, and she had lived her entire life at the edge of belonging. Born to one of the smallest, least influential family lines in the territory, she had grown up watching others take the center while she learned to stay quiet, to stay useful, and most importantly, to stay invisible. It was a skill she had perfected over the years, moving through the village with her head lowered, her tasks completed without complaint or recognition. Elara had never imagined she would be hiding in the forest, spying on a ritual she had been warned about since childhood. But then again she had never imagined her older brother would vanish without explanation either. 3 moons ago, Kale had been summoned to attend one of these same night gatherings. He had gone without protest, even with a strange distant look in his eyes, as if he had been expecting the call. He had never returned. When Elara asked about him, the answers were always the same. He has been reassigned. It is not your concern. The Alpha knows what is best. At first she had tried to believe them. The Alpha King, Darius Valen, was not a man anyone questioned openly. His rule had brought stability to their territory after years of violent disputes between rival factions. Under his command, borders were secured, enemies were driven back and order was restored. But order had come with silence. People spoke less, laughed less, and when they did speak, they kept their voices low, their eyes darting toward the central hall as if the walls themselves might carry their words to the Alpha's ears. Elara had noticed the disappearances long before Kale's. A healer's apprentice who simply stopped coming to the infirmary. A young hunter who never returned from a routine patrol. Each time there were explanations, transfers, missions, duties to the pack, but none of the missing ever came back to tell their own stories. And every time someone vanished, a ceremony followed soon after. That pattern was what had driven Elara into the forest tonight, her heart pounding as she slipped past the village's outer watch and followed the distant glow of torches into the trees. She had not planned to get this close. She had only meant to confirm that the ceremony was real, that it wasn't just another whispered myth used to keep lower-ranked members obedient. Now she knew the truth was far worse. In their world, rank was everything. From the moment a child could walk, they were taught the hierarchy of the pack. Alpha at the top, then the council of senior enforcers, then the hunters, the healers, and finally those like Elara's family, who performed the quiet, necessary tasks that kept the settlement functioning. Obedience was not just expected, it was ingrained, reinforced by years of stories about what happened to those who challenged the Alpha's authority. And the ceremony sat above all of it. It was never spoken of directly in the open, but everyone knew the rule. Only those summoned by name could attend. Anyone else caught even approaching the ritual grounds would face punishment severe enough to become a warning to others. Some said it was exile. Others whispered about public trials and harsher fates, but no one ever confirmed anything because no one who broke that rule was ever seen again. Elara had grown up hearing those warnings like bedtime stories meant to keep children from wandering too far at night. She had never thought she would become one of the ghosts in those stories. In the clearing, the ceremony continued. The pack members swayed gently with the rhythm of the chant, their voices blending into a low, haunting melody that seemed older than the territory itself. At the center, Alpha King Darius stood with his head slightly bowed, dark hair falling across his face as the firelight traced sharp lines along his jaw and cheekbones. Up close, he was even more imposing than Elara remembered. Tall enough to tower over most of the warriors, his build was powerful without being bulky, every movement precise, controlled, as if he wasted no energy on anything unnecessary. A long scar cut across one eyebrow, disappearing into his hairline, a silent reminder of the battles he had fought to claim his position. His reputation was carved as deeply into the pack's memory as that scar was into his skin. They said he had once challenged 3 rival alphas in a single night and walked away the sole survivor. They said he could sense lies before they were spoken and track prey across miles of forest without ever losing the trail. Watching him now, Elara found that she believed every rumor. He didn't shout orders or demand attention. He didn't need to. When he shifted his stance or lifted his hand, the entire circle adjusted in response, their obedience automatic and absolute. It wasn't just fear that kept them in line. It was something closer to reverence, as if they viewed him not just as a leader, but as a force of nature they had no choice but to obey. And tonight, that force had almost turned its full attention on her. A tremor ran through Elara's hands at the memory of his eyes locking onto her hiding place. She tightened her grip on the tree again, forcing herself to stay focused on the clearing. She needed to see what they were doing. At the edge of the circle, two enforcers stepped forward, guiding a lone figure into the light. The person's head was bowed, their hands bound loosely in front of them. Elara's breath caught as she leaned forward, trying to make out the face beneath the shadow of their hood. Not Kale. Relief and dread collided inside her chest. If it wasn't her brother, then this ceremony wasn't just about those who had already disappeared. It was something ongoing, something that could claim anyone at any time. The chanting shifted in tone, deepening into something more solemn. Darius stepped closer to the bound figure, his expression unreadable. For a moment he simply stood there, studying them as if weighing an invisible scale. The rest of the pack watched in absolute silence, their earlier rhythm fading into a tense stillness. Elara's thoughts raced. Was this a trial? A punishment? Some kind of initiation? No one had ever explained what the ceremony was meant to accomplish. They only said it was necessary, that it protected the pack from threats beyond their borders. But the fear in the bound figure's posture told a different story. Their shoulders were hunched, their head trembling slightly, as though they were fighting the urge to run even though escape was impossible. Darius reached out and lifted their chin with 2 fingers. Even from her hiding place, Elara could see the moment the captive's eyes met his. Something in their expression shifted, fear twisting into something more complex, almost resigned. The Alpha spoke, his voice low but carrying clearly through the clearing. You understand why you were brought here. The captive swallowed hard, their lips parting as if to speak. The words that came out were too quiet for Elara to hear, but the tremor in them was unmistakable. Darius studied them for another long second, then straightened, turning his gaze slowly around the circle as if inviting every member present to witness what would happen next. Elara's stomach tightened. This wasn't just a ritual. It was a demonstration. A message to everyone watching, and now, unknowingly, to her as well. She shifted her weight slightly, trying to ease the cramp forming in her leg. The movement was small, barely more than a breath, but the bark beneath her boot flaked away with a faint, traitorous crunch. The sound was soft, almost inaudible. But in the silence between 2 chants, it echoed like a gunshot in her ears. Darius's head snapped toward the trees again. And this time, there was no hesitation in his eyes. The forest seemed to shrink around Elara as the Alpha's gaze swept toward the trees for the second time that night. He hadn't seen her yet, she was sure of that, but the certainty that he was searching for something, someone, pressed against her ribs like a tightening band. The bound figure at the center of the clearing remained frozen, forgotten for the moment as every pair of eyes flicked between their Alpha and the dark tree line. Darius held the silence for several heartbeats, his expression sharpened by suspicion. Then, with visible restraint, he turned back toward the captive and lifted his hand in a slow, controlled motion. The ceremony resumed. But something had changed. The chanting was softer now, less confident, as if the pack itself had sensed the disturbance. The 2 enforcers standing behind the captive shifted their footing, their hands resting closer to the hilts of their weapons. Torches crackled and hissed, throwing restless light across faces that no longer looked entirely certain. Elara swallowed hard. She should leave. Every instinct screamed at her to slip away into the darkness while she still could, to retrace her steps through the underbrush and pretend she had never been here. But her feet remained rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on the scene unfolding before her. Because now she was seeing details no one had ever described. Darius stepped closer to the captive again. The chanting dropped to a low hum, more vibration than sound, resonating through the clearing like a distant storm. With deliberate slowness, the Alpha removed the leather glove from his right hand and let it fall to the ground beside him. His bare skin caught the torchlight, and for a brief second, Elara thought she saw something strange along his wrist. A faint, darkened pattern just beneath the surface like bruising, or veins standing out unnaturally. He flexed his fingers once as if testing them. Then he placed his palm flat against the captive's chest. The bound figure gasped, their back arching as if a sudden jolt had run through them. The circle of pack members lowered their heads in unison, some dropping to one knee. The motion was so synchronized it looked rehearsed, practiced over years of repetition. Submission. Not to the ritual itself, to him. Elara's breath caught in her throat. She had bowed to Darius before, as everyone did during official gatherings, but this was different. This was absolute surrender, bodies folding in on themselves in quiet, unquestioning obedience. Darius's jaw tightened. Up close, the change in him was impossible to miss now. A faint tremor ran through his arm where his hand pressed against the captive. His shoulders were rigid, his breathing uneven, each inhale slightly sharper than the last. He was struggling. The realization sent a jolt through Elara's chest. The Alpha King, the man rumored to be unbreakable, looked as though he were holding back something inside his own body. The darkened veins along his wrist seemed to spread slightly, pulsing once beneath his skin. The captive let out a strained cry. A ripple of unease passed through the circle, but no one moved. They kept their heads bowed, their hands pressed to the ground or clasped in front of them, as if acknowledging the suffering in front of them was a form of disobedience. "What is he doing?" Elara whispered to herself, the words barely forming on her lips. Darius closed his eyes. The chanting grew louder again, rising in pitch and urgency, as if the pack were trying to drown out the sounds of the captive's ragged breathing. Sweat beaded along the Alpha's temple, catching in his dark hair as his fingers dug slightly into the captive's clothing. For a moment, Elara thought she saw the captive's chest glow faintly beneath his hand, a trick of the firelight perhaps, but the way their body convulsed suggested something far more real was happening. This was no simple ceremony. It was a transfer. Or a taking. Elara shifted her weight again, leaning a little farther out from behind the tree to get a clearer view. A branch brushed against her shoulder and she froze instantly, waiting for someone to react. No one did. Their attention was fixed entirely on the Alpha and the struggling figure beneath his hand. The glow, if it was truly there, seemed to fade. The captive sagged forward, their strength leaving them all at once. Darius inhaled sharply, stumbling back a half step before catching himself. He lifted his hand slowly, staring at his own palm as if he didn't quite trust what he was seeing. The veins along his wrist were darker now, more pronounced. The chanting stopped again. One of the older council members, a silver-haired man named Torvin, stepped forward cautiously. His posture was respectful, but his eyes flicked to Darius's trembling hand with poorly concealed concern. "My king," Torvin said quietly, "should we?" Darius cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice carried a rough edge Elara had never heard before. "Continue." The captive was lowered gently to their knees by the enforcers. Their chest rose and fell in shallow, exhausted breaths, but they were alive. Whatever had just happened, it had not killed them, though it had clearly taken something from them. Elara's mind raced. Was this why people disappeared? Were they brought here to have whatever that was done to them? And if so, what did Darius gain from it? Strength? Power? Something worse? Her foot shifted again, and this time she realized with a surge of dread that she was running out of solid ground. The tree she hid behind sat on a slight slope, its roots exposed where rain had washed the soil away. One wrong move and she would slide forward into the open underbrush that separated her from the clearing. She forced herself to stay still. In the clearing, the ceremony moved into another phase. Two pack members brought forward a shallow stone basin filled with dark liquid that reflected the torchlight like ink. Darius dipped his fingers into it, his movements slower now, more deliberate. He brought the liquid to his lips. Elara's stomach twisted. The pack watched in reverent silence as he swallowed. A few of them bowed even lower, pressing their foreheads to the ground. The captive, still kneeling, stared at the Alpha with a hollow, dazed expression, as though something essential had been drained from them along with their strength. Elara leaned forward again despite herself. She had to understand. Every story she had been told about this ceremony, about its sacredness, its necessity, felt hollow now compared to what she was witnessing. This wasn't about honoring ancient traditions. This was about power, about maintaining something inside the Alpha that he could not control on his own. And if that was true, then her brother hadn't been reassigned. He had been used. The thought hit her so hard she nearly gasped aloud. She bit down on the inside of her cheek to keep silent, the coppery taste of blood filling her mouth as she forced the sound back down her throat. In that moment of distraction, her foot slipped. It wasn't a large movement, just a slight shift as the loose soil gave way beneath her boot, but it was enough. A small stone tumbled down the slope, bouncing once against an exposed root before disappearing into the underbrush with a soft, unmistakable clack. The sound was tiny, but in the fragile silence between ritual phases, it was deafening. Darius's head snapped toward the trees. The rest of the pack followed his gaze instantly, their bodies tensing like a single organism reacting to a threat. Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. For one frozen second, she considered staying where she was, praying that the darkness would hide her. But she knew better. He had sensed her before she made any noise. Now she had given him one. A low growl rumbled from somewhere within the circle. Not Darius, but one of the enforcers already shifting into a defensive stance. Hands moved to weapons. Torches lifted higher, their light stabbing deeper into the shadows. There, one of them whispered, pointing directly at her tree. Panic surged through her. She pushed away from the trunk, turning to run, and the dry twig beneath her heel snapped with a sharp, betraying crack. The sound cut through the forest like a blade. Someone's in the trees. The shout shattered the last illusion of safety. Elara ran. Branches whipped against her arms and face as she plunged deeper into the forest, her breath tearing in and out of her chest in ragged bursts. Behind her, she heard the pounding of boots against the forest floor, the sharp commands of enforcers spreading out to cut off her escape routes. She had always been fast. Years of running errands across uneven terrain had made sure of that, but she had never been chased by trained hunters before. "Stop!" a voice barked from behind her. "You're surrounded." She didn't look back. The ground sloped downward, forcing her to half-slide, half-run through a narrow stretch of undergrowth. Her mind raced, trying to recall the safest path back to the village, but in the darkness and panic, every direction looked the same. A hand brushed the back of her cloak. She twisted away instinctively, stumbling as her boot caught on a hidden root. The world tilted and she hit the ground hard, the air bursting from her lungs in a painful rush. Before she could scramble back to her feet, two heavy figures crashed through the bushes on either side of her. Rough hands grabbed her arms, hauling her upright as she kicked and struggled, pure adrenaline driving her movements. "Let go of me," she gasped, thrashing against their grip. "Please?" "Quiet," one of the enforcers snarled, tightening his hold until pain shot through her shoulder. "You've seen what you shouldn't." Torchlight flooded the clearing they dragged her into. The ceremony circle had broken apart, pack members standing in tense clusters as they watched her being forced forward. The captives still knelt near the center, forgotten in the chaos, their hollow eyes tracking Elara's movements with distant curiosity. And at the very center stood Darius. He hadn't moved from where she had last seen him. His posture was rigid, his gaze fixed on her as the enforcers pushed her to her knees in front of him. Up close, his presence was suffocating. Not just because of his size, but because of the raw, coiled energy that seemed to radiate from him in waves. Elara's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear the murmurs spreading through the pack. "A spy. She's from the lower quarter, isn't she? She should be executed for this." She squeezed her eyes shut for a second, bracing herself for the blow, the command, the inevitable punishment she had been warned about her entire life. It never came. When she forced her eyes open again, Darius was still staring at her. Not with rage. With confusion. His brow was furrowed, his head tilted slightly to one side as if he were studying a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. The darkened veins along his wrist pulsed once beneath his skin, visible even in the unsteady torchlight. "She," he began, his voice quieter than she expected. He stopped himself, inhaling sharply through his nose. The enforcer holding Elara's arm tightened his grip. "My king, give the order." She trespassed on sacred ground. Every eye in the clearing turned to Darius. This was the moment when the Alpha King was meant to demonstrate his ruthlessness, to reinforce the rule that no one, regardless of rank, could break the pack's laws without consequence. Elara bowed her head, waiting. Instead, Darius took a single step forward. "Release her," he said. The words fell into the clearing like a dropped blade. The enforcers hesitated, exchanging a glance. "My king?" one of them asked, clearly certain he had misheard. "I said," Darius repeated, his voice gaining an edge of command, "release her." Slowly, reluctantly, the hands gripping Elara's arms loosened and fell away. She remained on her knees, too stunned to move. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the pack. Torvin stepped forward again, his lined face creased with worry. "Darius, this is against." "I am aware of the law," Darius snapped, cutting him off. He didn't look away from Elara as he spoke. "I wrote it." Silence swallowed the clearing. Elara dared to lift her head slightly, meeting his gaze for the first time without the barrier of distance or darkness. Up close, his eyes were not just intense. They were searching, scanning her face as if trying to match her features to a memory he couldn't quite reach. "Stand," he ordered. Her legs trembled as she pushed herself upright. Every instinct screamed at her to run again, but the ring of pack members surrounding them made that impossible. Darius circled her once, slow and deliberate, his steps measured. She could feel the heat of his presence at her back, the way the entire clearing held its breath as he studied her from every angle. "You came here alone," he said finally, stopping in front of her again. It wasn't a question. Elara swallowed. "Why, yes, my king. Why?" The truth pressed against her lips. About Kale, about the disappearances, about the doubts that had been festering inside her for months. But fear wrapped around her throat, choking the words before they could escape. I was curious," she said weakly, knowing how pathetic it sounded. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face. Behind him, Torvin cleared his throat. "Curiosity is not a defense against treason." Darius ignored him. Instead, he lifted his hand slowly as if drawn by an invisible force, and stopped just short of touching Elara's cheek. The dark veins beneath his skin pulsed again, more violently this time. He inhaled deeply. And for a moment, the confusion in his eyes deepened into something dangerously close to recognition. Darius's hand hovered inches from Elara's face, suspended in the air as if an invisible barrier prevented him from closing the distance. The entire clearing seemed to lean forward with him. Elara could hear her own breathing, shallow and uneven, loud in her ears despite the oppressive silence around them. She didn't dare step back. She didn't dare move at all. His eyes, dark, sharp, and searching, studied her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, as though he were looking past her features and into something deeper she could neither see nor understand. He inhaled again, slower this time. A visible shudder ran through him. Torvin noticed it immediately. "My king," the elder said carefully, his voice edged with concern and caution in equal measure, "you are not well. The ritual must be completed before." "I know what the ritual requires," Darius cut in, though the sharpness of his tone lacked its usual strength. His attention remained fixed on Elara. "And yet, it is not behaving as expected." Murmurs rippled through the gathered pack. Elara's confusion deepened. Not behaving as expected? She had always assumed these ceremonies were rigid, rehearsed, executed the same way every time. The idea that something could go wrong, that the Alpha himself could be uncertain, cracked the image of absolute control she had been raised to believe in. Darius finally lowered his hand, but instead of stepping away, he circled her again, slower this time, his gaze flicking briefly to the surrounding torches before returning to her face. "You were at the edge of the clearing when the first phase began," he said, more to himself than to her. "And when I reached for him," he gestured faintly toward the kneeling captive. The transfer faltered. Elara blinked. Transfer? The word hung between them like a forbidden secret. Torvin's expression hardened. "This discussion should not be held in front of her," he said, his voice dropping to a warning rumble. "She has already seen too much." Darius straightened, finally tearing his gaze away from Elara to face his counsel. "She has seen what all of you see," he replied coldly. "Nothing more." "That is not true," Torvin insisted. "She saw you weaken." A flicker of anger sparked in Darius's eyes, but it vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by something far more dangerous: exhaustion. Elara watched the exchange with a growing sense of unreality. The Alpha King, the man whose word was law, was being challenged openly, and he wasn't crushing the dissent immediately. Instead, he seemed to be weighing every word, every reaction, as if balancing something fragile inside himself. Darius turned back to her. "What is your name?" he asked. "Elara," she whispered, her voice barely carrying beyond the circle around them. He repeated it quietly, tasting the syllables as if they were unfamiliar. Elara. The dark veins along his wrist pulsed again, spreading faintly toward his palm. He clenched his fist, hiding them from view, but not before several council members exchanged troubled glances. "When I first sensed you," he said slowly, "it was not like sensing an intruder. It was," he hesitated, his brow furrowing. "It was like sensing a disruption in my own heartbeat." A chill ran through Elara's spine. "What does that mean?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. The pack gasped softly at her audacity, but Darius did not rebuke her. Instead, he studied her more intently, as though the fact that she had spoken so directly was another anomaly to be examined. "It means," he said at last, "that when you were near, the ritual's effect diminished." Torvin stepped forward sharply. "Darius, you cannot seriously be suggesting." "I am stating what I experienced," Darius replied, his patience fraying. "The pain subsided when she was closest. It intensified when she was distant. The word pain echoed in Elara's mind. "You're in pain?" she asked before she could think better of it. This time the reaction from the pack was louder, a wave of shocked murmurs, some bordering on outrage. To question the Alpha's strength so openly was nearly unthinkable. But Darius did not deny it. For a long moment, he simply held her gaze, and in his silence, Elara saw something she had never expected to see in him: vulnerability. "The ritual," he said finally, choosing each word carefully, "stabilizes something within me that has been deteriorating since I assumed this role." The revelation landed like a stone dropped into still water, ripples of disbelief spreading outward through the circle. Elara's thoughts reeled. So those people who disappear. "They are volunteers," Torvin snapped, stepping between them as if physically blocking her from the conversation. "Chosen to serve the pack in ways you cannot comprehend." "Enough, Torvin," Darius said sharply. "Your secrecy has already created more problems than it has solved." He turned back to Elara. "The ritual is not symbolic," he said. "It is necessary. Without it, the condition that allows me to lead, to sense threats, to maintain control over the shifting between forms, becomes unstable." Elara stared at him, trying to reconcile this new information with everything she had been taught. "So you take something from them?" Darius's jaw tightened. "I borrow strength. Temporarily." Her gaze flicked to the kneeling captive, who still swayed weakly where they knelt. Borrowed or not, they looked hollowed out, as though a part of them had been stripped away. "And tonight," Darius continued, his voice lower now, "for the first time since my coronation, the ritual did not proceed as it should." He stepped closer again, the distance between them shrinking to less than an arm's length. "Because of you." The word struck Elara harder than any blow. "I didn't do anything," she said, her voice shaking. "I was just watching." "That is precisely the problem," he replied. "You were doing nothing, and yet your mere presence altered the outcome." He lifted his hand again, slower this time, and this time he did not stop short. His fingers brushed lightly against the side of her neck. A jolt of warmth shot through both of them. Darius jerked his hand back as if burned. Elara staggered half a step, her own pulse suddenly pounding with unnatural intensity. For a brief, disorienting moment, the world seemed sharper, the torchlight brighter, the sounds of the forest louder. The pack erupted into startled whispers. "Did you see that? The aura, it reacted to her." Torvin's face had gone pale. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice trembling despite his attempt at composure. "My king, whatever she is interfering with the balance the ritual maintains. She cannot be allowed to remain near you." Darius flexed his hand slowly, staring at his palm. The dark veins had receded slightly, their pulsing less violent than before. "She is not interfering," he said quietly. "She is stabilizing." The clearing fell silent again, the weight of that single word settling over them all. The accusation came from the far side of the circle. "She is a contaminant." The voice belonged to Melis, one of the oldest and most influential elders in the pack. Her white hair was braided tightly against her scalp, her thin frame wrapped in ceremonial robes that marked her status. She stepped forward slowly, leaning on a carved wooden staff, her sharp eyes fixed on Elara as though she were inspecting a diseased animal. "The ritual has functioned for generations," Melis continued, her voice carrying surprising strength. "And now, the first night an unsanctioned observer intrudes, it falters. This is not coincidence. It is corruption." A low murmur of agreement spread through parts of the pack. Elara felt the hostility like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She resisted the urge to step closer to Darius, even though every instinct told her he was the only thing keeping the others from tearing her apart. "She should be punished," another council member said. "If we allow this breach to go unanswered, we weaken the very laws that keep us united." Torvin nodded grimly. "The law is clear. Anyone who witnesses the ceremony without sanction must be executed to preserve its sanctity." The word executed echoed in Elara's skull, hollow and final. She looked at Darius. For a moment he said nothing. His gaze moved slowly from one council member to another, taking in their rigid postures, their expectation of swift, ruthless judgment. This was the role he had played for years, the alpha who never hesitated, who enforced the pack's laws with iron certainty. But now, his hand still tingled from where it had touched Elara's skin. The pain that had been building inside him for weeks, the slow, creeping instability that no ritual seemed to fully contain, had quieted in her presence. He could feel it even now, a strange calm settling beneath his ribs whenever she stood within arm's reach. Killing her would restore order. It would also bring the pain roaring back. Darius's jaw clenched. "Elara," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "Step closer." The command startled both her and the council. She hesitated, glancing nervously at the hostile faces surrounding her before obeying. Each step felt like walking deeper into a trap, yet she stopped only when she stood directly beside him. He turned to face the pack, his voice rising so it carried to the edges of the clearing. "You all witnessed what occurred tonight," he said. "You saw the ritual falter. You saw my condition worsen when she was distant, and ease when she was near. That proves nothing," Melis snapped. "It proves only that she disrupts the sacred process." Darius's eyes flashed. "Then observe." Before anyone could stop him, he reached out and clasped Elara's wrist. A collective gasp rippled through the pack. Elara felt the same surge of warmth as before, stronger this time. Darius's shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, dropped slightly, as though an invisible burden had been lifted from them. The faint tremor in his hands stilled. "You see," he said, his voice steadier now. "No ritual. No sacrifice. And yet the instability recedes." Silence. The elders stared at the joined hands as if witnessing something blasphemous. "This is madness," Torvin whispered. "To depend on an unranked girl." "I do not depend on her," Darius interrupted, though the tightness in his expression betrayed the lie even as he spoke it. "I acknowledge a phenomenon that requires understanding, not blind fear." Melis slammed her staff against the ground. "You are risking the integrity of the entire pack for one anomaly. If word spreads that the Alpha spares a trespasser, worse, that he keeps her close for his own weakness, our enemies will scent that weakness like blood in the water." The metaphor hung heavily in the air. Darius knew she was right. Authority in a pack was maintained not just through strength, but through the perception of strength. Any sign of vulnerability could fracture loyalty, invite challenges, ignite the very chaos he had fought so hard to suppress. He released Elara's wrist slowly. For a moment, the pain flickered back, a sharp, familiar pulse behind his eyes, and he almost reached for her again without thinking. He stopped himself, clenching his fist at his side. This was his choice. To maintain the illusion of invincibility, or to preserve the one factor that might actually keep him alive. The entire pack watched him, waiting. Darius drew in a long breath and stepped forward, placing himself between Elara and the council. "She will not be harmed," he said. The words fell into the clearing with the force of a thunderclap. Shock rippled outward in visible waves. Some pack members staggered back as if physically struck by the declaration. Others stared at him in open disbelief, their carefully maintained composure shattered. "You would defy our laws for her?" Torvin demanded, his voice cracking. "I am the law," Darius replied, his tone cold and final. "And I am revising it." Melis's eyes narrowed to slits. "Then say it plainly, Darius Valen. Say that you choose this girl over the traditions that have sustained us for generations." A muscle jumped in Darius's jaw. He glanced briefly at Elara, at her pale face, her wide, terrified eyes, and then back at the gathered pack. "I choose the survival of this pack," he said, his voice carrying to the edges of the forest. "And if that survival requires protecting the one person who can stabilize the Alpha without draining the strength of our own people, then yes, I choose her." The clearing erupted into stunned silence. It was not just the words that shocked them. It was the vulnerability woven through them, the open admission that he needed something, that he was not the untouchable force they had believed him to be. For the first time since he had taken the Alpha's mantle, Darius had exposed a weakness in front of every rank, every elder, every potential rival. And he had done it willingly. Elara felt the weight of dozens of stares shift from him to her, now tinged with something new, not just hatred or suspicion but fear. Because in a single, unprecedented moment, the Alpha King had tied his own stability to the life of a low-ranked girl who had once been invisible. And nothing in the pack would ever be the same again. For several long seconds after Darius's declaration, no one moved. The clearing, once filled with ritual chants and rigid ceremony, now felt fractured, the carefully maintained order shattered by a single decision. The torches crackled in the silence, their flames bending in the night wind as if even the fire struggled to settle after what had just occurred. Elara stood frozen beside him, her heart still racing, trying to comprehend what his words truly meant. "She will not be harmed." The sentence echoed in her mind, surreal and heavy. Only an hour earlier, she had been just another low-ranked girl who kept her head down and completed her chores without being noticed. Now she stood at the center of the most powerful gathering in the pack, every gaze fixed on her as though she had stepped into a role no one had ever intended her to fill. The ceremony had stopped completely. The kneeling captive was quietly escorted away by two healers, their weakened form half supported as they disappeared into the shadows beyond the torchlight. The stone basin sat abandoned near the center, its dark liquid reflecting distorted fragments of flame. No one moved to resume the ritual. No one even suggested it. Darius's decision had made continuation impossible. Torvin was the first to recover enough composure to speak. His voice was low, but the tension in it cut through the clearing like a drawn blade. "You have dismissed centuries of tradition in a single breath," he said. "The pack will talk, Darius. They will question." "Let them," Darius replied, though the fatigue in his eyes had not fully faded. "If our traditions demand we drain our own people when another path exists, then they deserve to be questioned." A ripple of uneasy murmurs followed his words, spreading outward through the gathered pack. Some faces reflected anger. Others showed fear. But a few, especially among the younger members, held something closer to relief, as if they had long sensed something wrong with the rituals but had never dared voice it. Elara noticed it all with a strange sense of detachment, as though she were watching events unfold from outside her own body. Melee struck her staff against the ground again, though the gesture now lacked its earlier authority. "This gathering is over," she announced, her voice tight. "Return to your quarters. We will reconvene at dawn to discuss the consequences of tonight." No one argued. One by one, the pack members began to disperse, their hushed conversations blending into a restless hum as they slipped back into the forest. Some cast lingering glances at Elara as they passed, curious, suspicious, or openly hostile, but none approached her. The invisible barrier of Darius's protection held firm around her like an unseen wall. Within minutes, the once crowded clearing was nearly empty. Only a handful of guards remained at the edges, their eyes scanning the tree line out of habit more than necessity. Torvin and Melis retreated together, their heads bent in urgent discussion, their silhouettes gradually swallowed by the darkness. Elara exhaled slowly, not realizing until that moment how tightly she had been holding her breath. The night air felt colder now. Darius stepped away from her for the first time since making his declaration. The movement was subtle, but Elara felt the shift instantly, the strange warmth that had settled in her chest fading slightly as the distance between them grew. He rolled his shoulders once, testing his balance as if reacquainting himself with his own body. "It seems," he said quietly, more to himself than to her, "that I am capable of standing without collapsing after all." Elara let out a weak, incredulous laugh before she could stop herself. The sound startled them both, hanging awkwardly in the empty clearing. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, lowering her gaze. "I didn't mean." "You're allowed to react," Darius interrupted, his tone softer than she had ever heard it. "Tonight has been unusual for both of us." The understatement almost made her laugh again. For a few moments they simply stood there, the weight of everything that had happened settling between them. Without the watchful eyes of the pack pressing down on them, the tension in Darius's posture seemed to loosen slightly. He looked less like the untouchable Alpha King and more like a man who had just fought a battle no one else could see. Elara finally found her voice. "My king, why did you really spare me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing where one of the torches still burned and pulled it from the ground. The flame illuminated his features in shifting gold and shadow as he turned back toward her. "Because killing you would have been easier," he said. "And easier is not always correct." She frowned, confusion knitting her brows. "That doesn't sound like something people say about you." A faint, humorless smile touched his lips. "People say many things about me. Very few of them are based on conversations they have actually had with me." He approached slowly, stopping at a respectful distance this time. The torchlight flickered between them, casting long shadows across the disturbed earth where the ceremony had taken place. "When I first sensed you tonight," he continued, "I thought it was a threat. An enemy infiltrator, perhaps. But the closer I came, the more it felt familiar." Elara's stomach twisted. Familiar how? Darius studied her face, as though searching for a reflection of that strange familiarity in her features. "Like a missing piece suddenly returning to its place," he said at last. "Something I had been compensating for without realizing it was gone." The words were strange, almost abstract, but the sincerity in his voice made it impossible to dismiss them. "So what happens now?" she asked quietly. "The elders, they're not going to accept this easily." "No," he agreed. "They won't." He glanced toward the forest where the others had disappeared, his expression hardening slightly as the weight of his responsibilities settled back onto his shoulders. But they will obey, he added. They always do. The confidence in his tone should have been reassuring, yet Elara sensed the subtle crack beneath it, the awareness that tonight had shifted something fundamental within the pack's power structure. He had maintained his authority, but at the cost of revealing that he was not invulnerable. And she was now part of that vulnerability. The realization made her chest tighten. I never wanted this, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to know what happened to my brother. Darius's gaze sharpened. Your brother? Cale, she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. He was taken to one of these ceremonies 3 moons ago. They told me he was reassigned, but after what I saw tonight. Darius's silence spoke volumes before he even answered. He volunteered, he said finally. He was strong. Loyal. He offered his strength willingly to stabilize the pack. The explanation did little to ease the ache in her chest. And now? He is alive, Darius said, and there was a hint of relief in his tone, as though he understood how important that detail was. But weakened. Like the one you saw tonight. The effects fade with time, but not without cost. Elara closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the information. At least Cale wasn't dead. But the idea that he had been drained, used, left a bitter taste in her mouth. When she opened her eyes again, Darius was watching her closely. You risked your life for answers, he said. Most in your position would have accepted the official explanation and moved on. I tried, she admitted. But it never felt right. A slow nod. That stubbornness may have saved more lives than you realize. The forest around them had grown quieter, the night returning to its natural rhythm now that the pack had dispersed. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, its lonely cry echoing between the trees. Darius planted the torch back into the ground, its flame casting a steady pool of light around them. You cannot return to the lower quarters as if nothing has changed, he said. The pack has seen you at my side. They know I have claimed responsibility for your safety. That alone alters your standing. Elara's stomach dropped. I don't want special treatment. I don't want people looking at me like I'm some kind of threat. You may not want it, he said, but it is already happening. She knew he was right. The way the others had stared at her as they left the clearing, the mix of resentment, fear, and curiosity, had made it painfully clear that she would never be invisible again. You will stay in the guest wing of the main hall for now, Darius continued, until we determine how best to integrate this new situation into pack law. The word integrate sounded clinical, almost detached, yet Elara understood what he meant. They were both now part of something unprecedented, a dynamic that the pack's traditions had no guidelines for. She nodded slowly. And you? A flicker of weariness crossed his face. I will spend the rest of the night explaining my decision to people who believe they know better than I do. For the first time since she had met him, she felt a surge of sympathy for the man behind the title. They stood in silence for another moment, the events of the night settling into memory rather than immediate reality. The clearing that had once seemed so terrifying now looked almost ordinary, just a patch of trampled grass and scattered torchlight beneath a canopy of ancient trees. But Elara knew nothing about her life would ever be ordinary again. Darius turned to leave, then paused, glancing back at her over his shoulder. Elara. Yes. Tonight you stopped something from breaking completely, he said. I do not yet understand why, but I intend to find out. There was no dramatic declaration, no elaborate promise, just a simple statement of intent. Yet it carried more weight than any oath. He began walking toward the path leading back to the settlement. After a brief hesitation, Elara followed, the two of them moving side by side through the dark forest, their footsteps the only sound on the narrow trail. They did not speak again. They didn't need to. The space between them held a new, fragile understanding. A silent recognition that their fates were now tied together in ways neither of them had chosen, yet neither could ignore. And as the first faint hints of dawn began to lighten the horizon beyond the trees, Elara realized that the girl who had crept into the forest hours earlier, curious, invisible, and powerless, was already someone she would never be again. If this story pulled you in and you want to see what happens next, whether the pack truly accepts Elara's new role, what secrets still surround the Alpha's condition, and how their bond might reshape the entire territory, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps bring more stories like this to life, and the next chapter is already waiting to be told.